The heavy air of Calusa hung thick and still over Oakhaven Correctional Facility in the summer of 2018. Gray concrete walls, stained by relentless sun and infrequent rain, seemed to absorb the oppressive heat, radiating it back into the enclosed yards and echoing corridors. The sounds were a dreary symphony, the distant clang of steel doors, the rhythmic scuff of standard-issue shoes on worn linoleum, the disembodied crackle of radios, and the low, constant murmur of hundreds of confined lives. For Kesha Johnson, inmate number 74,312, each day bled into the next with a suffocating sameness, the jarring blare of the morning alarm, the impersonal count, the bland breakfast, the long hours folding stiff sheets in the steamy, lint-filled prison laundry. Another count, dinner, lockdown, the restless dark. It was a cycle designed to grind down the spirit. She was serving 5 years for a burglary gone wrong, a desperate mistake born of circumstances she rarely allowed herself to dwell on. Freedom was a hazy concept, a shore too distant to truly imagine reaching. Barely into her 20s, Kesha possessed a resilience that hadn't yet been extinguished by the drab uniformity of prison life. Her eyes, though often shadowed with fatigue, held a watchful intelligence. She had learned quickly the cardinal rules of survival within these walls. Keep your head down, trust no one completely, observe everything. She moved through her days with a quiet determination, her face usually a carefully maintained mask of neutrality. She performed her duties efficiently, avoided unnecessary conflicts, and found solace in the tattered paperbacks occasionally available from the prison library cart. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, hoarding her thoughts and emotions like precious contraband. Amidst the shifting roster of correctional officers, most blurring into a collective image of khaki uniforms and stern expressions, one man began to stand out in Kesha's perception. Officer Marcus Brown. He wasn't overtly kinder or more lenient than the others. The system didn't allow for much deviation. Yet there was something different in his bearing, a subtle lack of the hardened cynicism that seemed etched onto the faces of so many of his colleagues. Sometimes during the monotonous head counts or the slow patrols down the cell block, Kesha caught a flicker of something else in his gaze. Weariness, perhaps, or a hint of contemplation that went beyond the immediate demands of his job. He carried himself with a certain quiet authority, but without the aggressive edge some officers cultivated. Marcus Brown had walked these same corridors for 6 years. The initial sense of purpose, the belief he could make a difference, had long eroded under the weight of bureaucracy, the constant tension, and the daily exposure to the bleak realities of incarceration. He felt the dehumanizing effect of the job not just on the inmates, but on himself. The routine was soul-crushing, the environment inherently hostile. He saw the cycles of despair, the flashes of violence, the small kindnesses brutally extinguished. He felt increasingly like a cog in a machine he no longer fully believed in, trapped in his own way by the steady paycheck and the lack of appealing alternatives. He went through the motions, maintained professional distance, but a deep-seated dissatisfaction gnawed at him. Their awareness of each other grew incrementally, subtly. An accidental meeting of eyes held a fraction of a second too long during morning count. A brief pause by Marcus near Kesha's workstation in the laundry, his gaze sweeping over the area with professional thoroughness, yet somehow lingering. These were minuscule events, almost imperceptible to an outside observer, but in the hyper-aware, stimulus-deprived environment of Oakhaven, they resonated. Kesha started noticing the specific cadence of his footsteps approaching her cell block, the way he held his shoulders. Marcus found his eyes drawn to her during mealtimes, noting her quiet self-containment amidst the surrounding noise and chaos. Brief necessary exchanges, a request for cleaning supplies, and instruction during lockdown, began to feel charged with unspoken meaning. A standard "Johnson, step forward" during a count might be delivered with a tone slightly less harsh than usual. A dropped tray cleaned up without undue reprimand. These were tiny deviations from the norm, almost non-existent, yet they built a fragile, invisible thread between them. It was a dangerous awareness, a spark flickering in the suffocating atmosphere. The power imbalance was immense, The rules absolute. Interaction beyond the strictly professional was forbidden. The consequences severe for both. Yet the pull persisted. For Marcus, Kesha represented something other than just another inmate identification number. Perhaps it was her youth or the guarded intelligence in her eyes that hinted at a life beyond her current circumstances. She broke the monotony, an anomaly in the gray landscape of his daily grind. Observing her, interacting with her even minimally, stirred something dormant within him, a flicker of feeling beyond duty and disillusionment. For Kesha, Marcus's brief moments of perceived humanity were like finding a rare wildflower pushing through cracked pavement. The possibility that one of the authority figures saw her as more than her crime, even fleetingly, was a potent, dangerous allure. The risk was immense, a terrifying tightrope walk over a chasm of institutional retribution, but the silent understanding, the shared glances, the dangerous energy crackling between them in the sterile prison air became an undeniable force, pulling them closer despite the inherent perils. The temptation to acknowledge the connection, to step further across the forbidden line, grew stronger with each passing day. The unspoken tension between them eventually sought release, escalating from charged glances to whispered words exchanged in fleeting moments when the ever-watchful eyes of the prison system blinked. A note passed discreetly, a specific time suggested, a location chosen for its relative obscurity. Their first true rendezvous was a heart-pounding affair, held in the cramped confines of a utility closet adjacent to the laundry room. The air hung thick with the smell of industrial detergent and damp concrete. For precious minutes, shielded from view, the rigid roles of guard and inmate dissolved, replaced by the raw, undeniable connection between a man and a woman starved for genuine human contact. Fear was a palpable third presence in the small space, mingling with the intoxicating rush of transgression. These clandestine meetings became their fragile reality. They learned the prison's rhythms, the blind spots in patrol routes, the moments when a brief absence might go unnoticed. A disused storage room filled with obsolete equipment, smelling faintly of dust and decay, became another sanctuary. Sometimes it was the shadowy corner behind the large industrial dryers in the laundry after most other inmates had cleared out. Each encounter was a gamble, played against overwhelming odds. The risk was immense, a constant hum beneath the surface of their stolen intimacy. For Marcus, discovery meant immediate dismissal, disgrace, and potentially legal trouble. For Kesha, it meant severe disciplinary action, loss of privileges, possibly additional time added to her sentence, and the dangerous enmity of other guards and inmates if word got out. They existed in a bubble of shared secrecy, fueled by a potent cocktail of desire and adrenaline. The inherent danger seemed only to heighten the intensity of their connection. Every touch was electric, charged with the forbidden nature of their bond. Every quiet conversation, whispered amidst the institutional hum, felt profound. They clung to these moments, brief respites from the crushing weight of their respective confinements. It was an escape, a temporary suspension of the harsh rules that governed their lives. In those stolen minutes, they offered each other an illusion of normalcy, a glimpse of the tenderness and connection that the prison walls were designed to eradicate. Marcus began taking small, calculated risks, smuggling in minor tokens for Kesha. A single bar of chocolate, slipped into her hand during a moment of low surveillance, felt like a feast. A folded magazine, weeks out of date but offering pictures and stories from the outside world, was a treasure. These small gestures were fraught with peril, but served as tangible proof of his regard, affirmations of the secret world they were building together. Kesha, in return, offered him something less tangible but perhaps more valuable: her undivided attention, a listening ear free from the judgment or demands he faced elsewhere. In her presence, away from the rigid hierarchy and the constant vigilance, Marcus felt less like a uniformed automaton and more like a man. She saw past the badge, acknowledging the person beneath, and that silent recognition was a powerful balm to his jaded spirit. Weeks bled into a month, then two. Their illicit routine became almost comfortable, the initial terror softening into a constant, manageable anxiety. They grew bolder, perhaps careless, lulled by repeated success in evading detection. The frequency of their meetings increased slightly, the duration sometimes stretching by precious minutes. The bond deepened, evolving beyond pure physical attraction into a complex emotional dependency. They were each other's anchor in the bleak expanse of Oakhaven. It was around this time, deep into the humid Calusa summer, that Marcus started to feel unwell. At first, it was just a pervasive fatigue, a weariness that settled deep in his bones and wasn't alleviated by sleep. He attributed it to the long hours, the stressful nature of the job, the relentless heat. He pushed through it, relying on caffeine and willpower. Then came the night sweats. He would wake up in the pre-dawn hours, his t-shirt damp, the sheets clinging uncomfortably to his skin, even when the cheap air conditioner in his apartment rattled diligently. He dismissed it as a reaction to the summer heat or perhaps a lingering flu bug. A persistent, low-grade fever began to accompany the fatigue, making him feel slightly off-kilter, his head fuzzy. He popped over-the-counter pain relievers and told himself it was just a summer cold he couldn't quite shake. Working in a closed environment like a prison, germs circulated easily. He doubled down on his work, trying to ignore the subtle signals his body was sending, attributing the malaise to the accumulated toll of his demanding job and the secret strain of his relationship with Kesha. The gnawing feeling that something was truly wrong remained pushed to the periphery of his consciousness, overshadowed by the immediate risks and rewards of his forbidden affair. Yet the symptoms lingered, a quiet, persistent hum beneath the surface of his daily life, refusing to fully disappear. The persistent fatigue deepened, clinging to Marcus like a shroud he couldn't shake off. The night sweats became more frequent, leaving him feeling clammy and drained each morning. The low fever remained a constant, unwelcome companion. Simple tasks at work felt monumental, his usual stamina replaced by an unnerving weakness. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was mono, maybe Lyme disease from a forgotten tick bite, anything but the nameless dread that had begun to coil in his gut. Finally, unable to ignore the accumulating symptoms any longer, he scheduled an appointment with a doctor in a town 30 miles away from Oakhaven, seeking anonymity far from colleagues or anyone who might connect him to the prison. The clinic waiting room was sterile and impersonal, filled with the quiet shuffling of papers and the low murmur of daytime television. Marcus sat rigidly, flipping through a worn magazine without registering the words, acutely aware of every cough and sniffle around him. When his name was finally called, he followed the nurse down a brightly lit corridor, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope for a simple explanation and fear of the unknown. The doctor, a brisk, professional man, listened patiently as Marcus described his symptoms, careful to omit any details about his personal life or occupation that weren't strictly necessary. Blood was drawn, vials filled with a dark crimson that seemed suddenly ominous. The doctor mentioned running a standard panel, including tests for various infections, his tone non-committal. Marcus left the clinic feeling strangely hollow, the brief medical encounter offering no immediate answers, only the promise of a phone call in a few days. The waiting period was agonizing. Every waking moment was tinged with anxiety. He meticulously reviewed his recent past, searching for logical explanations for his illness, trying to convince himself it was something benign, treatable. He clung to the idea of a persistent virus, a bad reaction to something he ate, anything other than the darker possibilities that flickered at the edges of his thoughts. Sleep offered little respite, often interrupted by sweats or restless tossing. At work, he went through the motions robotically, his mind elsewhere, the familiar routines of Oakhaven feeling distant and unreal. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, while Marcus was off duty, staring blankly at the television in his small apartment. The caller ID showed the clinic's number, and his stomach clenched. He answered, his voice hoarse. The doctor's tone was calm, professional, yet devastatingly direct. There were no ambiguities. The tests had come back. Marcus was HIV positive. The 3 letters hung in the air, severing his life cleanly into before and after. The room seemed to spin slightly. He heard the doctor continue talking about next steps, treatment options, counseling resources, but the words blurred into an incomprehensible drone. Shock rendered him mute, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He managed a choked affirmative when asked if he understood, then ended the call, sinking onto the edge of his worn couch. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. The initial shock slowly receded, replaced by a wave of icy terror that spread through his veins, paralyzing him. His future, once a vague landscape of possibilities, now seemed like a narrow, shadowed path leading toward illness and uncertainty. Denial surged briefly, a mistake, a lab error. But the doctor's clinical certainty echoed in his mind. Then came the desperate, frantic question, how? He hadn't been reckless. He replayed the past year, then two, scrutinizing every encounter, every risk. His social life outside of work had been minimal, his relationships sparse and distant long before Oakhaven. The timeline contracted, focusing with horrifying clarity on the last few months, on the stolen moments in dimly lit storage rooms and the humid laundry. Kesha. The name struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was the only one. There was no other explanation. Suddenly, fragments of past conversations, previously insignificant remarks she'd made about feeling unwell before her incarceration, about bouts of fatigue or unexplained fevers she'd dismissed, resurfaced in his memory, twisted into damning evidence by his panicked mind. Had she known? The thought solidified instantly into certainty. She must have known. A cold, venomous rage began to bloom in the pit of his stomach, eclipsing the fear. He felt profoundly, utterly betrayed. The tenderness he had felt for her, the fragile connection they had built, curdled into bitter resentment and a burning sense of injustice. He saw her not as a partner in a forbidden affair, but as a calculating deceiver who had knowingly infected him, perhaps as a twisted form of revenge against the system he represented, or simply out of careless disregard. The transformation was swift and total. The man who had smuggled chocolate bars and shared whispered secrets ceased to exist, replaced by someone consumed by fury and a desperate need for retribution. The carefully constructed walls of his professional demeanor crumbled from within. At Oakhaven, his colleagues noticed the change. His usual quiet composure evaporated, replaced by a short temper and sullen withdrawal. He barked orders, responded curtly to questions, and his interactions with inmates became uniformly harsh, devoid of any hint of empathy. The shift was most pronounced in his dealings with Kesha. The furtive glances, once filled with warmth and shared secrets, now held a chilling hostility. When his patrol route took him past her cell or her workstation, his eyes would lock onto her with an accusatory glare that made her flinch and look away, bewildered and frightened by the sudden, inexplicable animosity. The secret bond was irrevocably broken, poisoned by his diagnosis and the hateful certainty of her deliberate betrayal. Evenings became a blur of cheap whiskey in his lonely apartment. He drank to numb the fear, to silence the raging thoughts, but the alcohol only sharpened the edges of his anger, fueling the dark resentment that festered inside him. Staring into the amber liquid, the image of Kesha's face would swim before him, no longer the object of affection, but the embodiment of his ruined future. The desire for vengeance began to coalesce, taking shape in the alcohol-fueled darkness. Marcus waited, his patience fueled by a cold, simmering rage that had become his constant companion since the diagnosis. He knew Kesha's schedule in the laundry, the ebb and flow of inmates and supervising officers. He observed her from a distance, his eyes narrowed, tracking her movements as she folded rough institutional sheets, her motions automatic, seemingly unaware of the storm gathering around her. The rhythmic thrum of the industrial dryers and the humid, detergent-laden air did nothing to soothe the tempest inside him. Every detail of her presence, the way her hair was tied back, the curve of her neck as she bent over her work, now ignited a fresh wave of bitterness. The intimacy they had shared felt like a cruel mockery, a deliberate poisoning. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until a shift change temporarily thinned the supervision, and most other inmates were occupied elsewhere or moving between assignments. The cavernous room, usually filled with noise and activity, fell into a brief lull. He approached her workstation near the back, his steps measured and heavy on the concrete floor, purposefully different from the quieter tread he'd used during their clandestine meetings. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched loosely at his sides, his face set in grim lines that replaced the careful neutrality of his uniform. Kesha looked up as he drew near, perhaps expecting one of their brief, stolen exchanges, a flicker of shared understanding in her eyes. But the expression she saw on his face stopped her cold. It wasn't the guarded affection or even the professional indifference she had known. It was something raw, distorted by an anger so profound it seemed almost alien on his features. Confusion clouded her face, quickly followed by a dawning unease. She instinctively took a small step back, bumping slightly against the metal laundry cart behind her. He didn't speak. Words felt inadequate, unnecessary for the accusation burning within him. Reaching out abruptly, he seized her upper arm, his grip far tighter than necessary, bruisingly strong. His fingers dug into her flesh through the thin fabric of her uniform. It wasn't a touch meant to connect, but to restrain, to punish. He leaned in slightly, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes, once the source of a forbidden warmth, now blazed with a cold, accusatory fire. They held no trace of their shared past, only condemnation and a terrifying intensity. A small gasp escaped Kesha's lips. Her eyes widened in shock and fear, searching his face for some explanation, some sign of the man she thought she knew. Her mouth opened slightly as if to ask a question, but no sound came out. Her expression shifted rapidly. Bewilderment, hurt, and then a wave of pure, unadulterated fear washed over her features as she registered the depth of his hostility. She tried instinctively to pull her arm away, a small, futile gesture against his superior strength. Her body tensed, bracing for something unknown, but undeniably threatening. Perhaps she didn't understand the specific accusations simmering behind his glare. Maybe the possibility of her own health status hadn't fully registered, or was something she feared confronting herself. Or perhaps the sheer unexpectedness and violence of his approach simply paralyzed her. But Marcus saw none of that nuance. Blinded by his own pain and the consuming certainty of her betrayal, he interpreted her fear as guilt, her confusion as evasion, her shocked silence as an admission. Every flicker of emotion across her face seemed to confirm his darkest suspicions. He felt a perverse satisfaction in her terror, a twisted justification for the rage that consumed him. The memory of the doctor's voice on the phone, the chilling finality of the diagnosis, the bleak landscape of his compromised future. It all coalesced into this single moment, directed entirely at the woman trembling in his grasp. She was the source, the cause, the embodiment of his shattered life. He felt the crushing weight of the irreversible change inflicted upon him, the stigma he would now carry forever, and saw only her face. With a guttural sound low in his throat, fueled by a surge of revulsion and pain, he shoved her violently away from him. The force of the push sent her stumbling backward, her hip colliding hard with the corner of the metal cart. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath more from shock than pain, catching herself just before falling onto the damp floor. He didn't wait to see her reaction. Turning sharply on his heel, his face still a mask of controlled fury, he strode out of the laundry room without a backward glance. The heavy door swung shut behind him with a dull thud, leaving Kesha alone amidst the humming machines and piles of clean linen. She remained frozen for a long moment, her breath coming in ragged gasps, one hand clutching her bruised arm, her eyes wide with terror and incomprehension. The warmth of their secret connection had been utterly extinguished, replaced by a chilling, inexplicable hostility that left her feeling profoundly isolated and vulnerable. As Marcus walked back towards the main corridor, the echoing clang of his own footsteps on the concrete sounded like the hammering finality of a decision made. The seed of vengeance, planted in the despair of his diagnosis and nurtured by alcohol and resentment, had now fully taken root. The hours of Marcus's night shift crawled by with agonizing slowness, each tick of the institutional clocks echoing the grim countdown in his mind. The cold resolve that had settled over him after the confrontation in the laundry had solidified into a hard, unyielding plan. He moved through the required motions of his duty, walking the dimly lit corridors, checking locks, peering through cell door windows, with an outward calm that belied the frantic storm raging within. His knowledge of Oakhaven, acquired over 6 years of monotonous routine, was now a crucial tool. He knew the blind spots where the aging surveillance cameras failed to reach, the predictable patterns of his fellow officers' patrols, the quietest hours when the vast concrete structure seemed to hold its breath. His mind worked with chilling clarity, mapping out the steps required, pushing aside the flickering remnants of guilt or hesitation with waves of burning resentment. The betrayal, as he perceived it, demanded this final, terrible resolution. He needed to get Kesha to a place where no one would see or hear them. The abandoned boiler room in the basement of B Block was perfect. It hadn't been operational for years, relegated to storing forgotten junk and collecting dust. It was isolated, thick-walled, far from the main thoroughfares of the prison, and notoriously overlooked during routine checks unless there was a specific reason to venture there. Access was restricted, but not impossible for an officer with the right keys and knowledge. The challenge was luring Kesha there without raising suspicion. He couldn't approach her directly after their last violent encounter. He used an intermediary, another inmate known for passing messages for a small price, someone unlikely to ask questions or remember specifics. The message was carefully crafted, hinting at an urgent need to talk, perhaps even an apology, suggesting a final, secret meeting to clear the air. Delivered with a feigned note of desperation that Marcus hoped would prey on any lingering hope or confusion Kesha might still harbor. The designated time was deep into the night shift, during a period when staff presence was minimal in that section. As the appointed hour approached, Marcus detached himself from his regular patrol route, citing a minor, fabricated issue that required his attention near the basement access point. He moved swiftly through the quieter service corridors, his keys jingling softly against his thigh, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. He unlocked the heavy steel door leading to the basement stairs, slipping through and securing it quietly behind him. The air grew cooler, damper, thick with the scent of mildew and stale machinery. He navigated the labyrinthine basement passages, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, finally reaching the boiler room door. He unlocked it and stepped inside, leaving the door slightly ajar, cloaked in shadows, waiting. The cavernous space was filled with the hulking, silent shapes of defunct boilers and tangled pipes, casting long, distorted shadows in the faint emergency lighting that filtered in from the corridor. Minutes later, he heard hesitant footsteps approaching down the passage. Kesha appeared at the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from the corridor. She paused, peering into the gloomy space, perhaps looking for him, her posture radiating uncertainty and a visible apprehension. Maybe she half expected an apology, a desperate plea, or maybe she feared another outburst. Whatever hope or fear brought her there, it was extinguished the moment she stepped fully inside, and Marcus emerged from the shadows, his face unreadable, but his intention terrifyingly clear in his eyes. There was no preamble, no final accusation. The rage he had been carefully nursing exploded. He moved on her before she could react, before any plea or cry could fully form on her lips. He grabbed her, muffling any sound she tried to make. His hand clamped hard over her mouth. The terror in her eyes was stark in the dim light as she realized the lethal intent behind his actions. She struggled instinctively, desperately, her body fueled by adrenaline in the primal urge to survive. But her strength was no match for his size and fury. The struggle was brief, brutal, and horribly one-sided, confined to the small, dusty space between the silent machines. He acted with a detached efficiency now, the earlier rage channeled into grim purpose. He overpowered her quickly, silencing her struggles, his actions driven by the singular, overriding need to erase the source of his pain and perceived betrayal. When it was over, an unnatural silence descended upon the boiler room, broken only by Marcus's own ragged breathing. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He stared down at Kesha's still form for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving behind a hollow ache and the first icy tendrils of real fear. But there was no time for remorse or panic. His training, his knowledge of procedure, and a powerful instinct for self-preservation took over. He began methodically erasing his presence. He carefully repositioned her body, attempting to stage the scene to suggest a fall or a desperate act of self-harm, something plausible within the grim context of prison life. He scanned the dusty floor, wiping away any obvious signs of struggle, checking her hands and clothing, ensuring none of his own hair or uniform fibers remained. He retrieved the small token he'd used to lure her, pocketing it. His movements were precise, almost robotic, his mind focused entirely on the task of concealment. He surveyed the room one last time, his flashlight beam sweeping over the silent machinery and concrete floor, searching for any overlooked detail. Satisfied, he backed out of the room, gently pulling the heavy door shut until the lock clicked softly into place. He took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed his uniform, and wiped his sweating palms on his trousers. Composing his features into a mask of bored professionalism, he emerged from the basement access, locking the door behind him, and melted back into the routine of his night shift patrol, his face impassive as he walked the sterile corridors, leaving the cold secret locked away in the darkness below. The discovery was made by a maintenance worker sent to investigate a tripped breaker in the basement circuits the following morning. The grim find in the disused boiler room sent ripples of unease and morbid curiosity through Oakhaven. Yellow tape appeared, cordoning off the basement access. Officials in suits, investigators from the state's Department of Corrections arrived, their presence casting a pall over the usual prison routine. Rumors spread like wildfire among the inmates and staff. An accident, a suicide, something more sinister. The atmosphere grew thick with suspicion and hushed speculation. Marcus moved through the ensuing chaos like a ghost, performing his duties with meticulous, almost exaggerated normalcy. He listened impassively as colleagues discussed the discovery, offering non-committal responses when asked for his opinion. He projected an air of professional detachment, mirroring the shock and mild concern expected of an officer uninvolved in the incident. When the investigators began their interviews, questioning staff who had been on duty the previous night, Marcus maintained his composure. He recounted his patrol routine, mentioned the fabricated minor issue that had drawn him near the basement stairs for a short time, but insisted he had seen or heard nothing unusual. His answers were concise, delivered in a steady tone, his gaze direct but carefully neutral. Years of wearing the uniform, of mastering the art of emotional suppression demanded by the job, served him well. He built a wall of professional conduct around himself, brick by careful brick. Inside, however, was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The lingering residue of rage, the gnawing acid of guilt, and the ever-present, suffocating fear of discovery. Every unexpected knock on his apartment door, every official-looking memo posted on the staff bulletin board, sent a jolt of panic through him. The internal investigation proceeded predictably. In a place like Oakhaven, unexpected deaths, while tragic, were not entirely uncommon. The initial assessment leaned towards accidental death or suicide, plausible explanations given the bleak environment and the known pressures faced by inmates. The boiler room was deemed an unsafe, restricted area, reinforcing the narrative of an unfortunate accident resulting from an inmate wandering where she shouldn't have been. Without clear evidence of foul play and lacking any witnesses, the investigators focused on routine protocols and potential security lapses. Marcus felt a sliver of relief. The focus seemed to be shifting away from homicide. He allowed himself to believe, just for moments at a time, that he might actually get away with it, that the secret would remain buried in the dusty basement. Then came the autopsy report. Official findings were usually kept confidential, but details inevitably leaked, filtering through the prison grapevine via clerks, medical staff, or guards privy to snippets of information. Marcus overheard fragments of conversation in the staff break room a few days later. Two officers were talking quietly, one mentioning the preliminary coroner's findings discussed during a briefing. The cause of death was confirmed, consistent with asphyxiation or injuries from a fall, the details still murky. But then came the unexpected detail, the piece of information that shattered Marcus's carefully constructed facade from the inside out. Kesha Johnson had been pregnant, early stages, perhaps 8 to 10 weeks along. Pregnant. The word hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow, sucking the air from his lungs. He stood frozen near the coffee machine, the cheap ceramic mug suddenly heavy in his hand. The casual tone of his colleagues discussing the finding seemed obscene, unbearable. He turned away abruptly, heading towards the restroom, needing desperately to escape the conversation, to process the catastrophic implication. He stared at his own reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink, but the face looking back seemed like a stranger's, pale, haunted, lines etched around eyes that held a new, deeper level of horror. Pregnant. His child. The mathematical certainty was inescapable. The timing coincided perfectly with their affair. The rage and sense of betrayal that had fueled his actions now seemed monstrously misplaced, disgustingly selfish. He hadn't just killed Kesha, the woman he blamed for ruining his life. He had extinguished the nascent life growing inside her, his own potential continuation. The weight of this realization was crushing, far heavier than the fear of legal consequences. It was a profound, soul-deep violation that stripped away any lingering justification he might have clung to. The image of Kesha, no longer just the perceived source of his illness, but as the carrier of his unborn child, overwhelmed him with a guilt so potent it threatened to suffocate him. The official investigation eventually concluded, hampered by the lack of clear evidence and the inherent difficulties of probing incidents within the closed walls of a prison. Kesha Johnson's death was officially ruled undetermined, likely accidental or suicide. The file eventually closed. Security protocols around basement access were reviewed and tightened. Life, or the prison version of it, moved on. Kesha's cell remained empty for a while before being assigned to a new inmate. Marcus continued his job at Oakhaven. He showed up for his shifts, walked the corridors, enforced the rules, outwardly unchanged. He was free, untouched by the justice system. But the knowledge became his true sentence, an invisible, inescapable prison. Every day was a torment. Passing the empty cell, later occupied by someone else, was a fresh stab of guilt. Seeing pregnant visitors during visiting hours triggered waves of nausea. The diagnosis that had initially consumed him with anger now felt like a secondary punishment, a constant physical reminder of the life he had taken and the other life he had destroyed before it even had a chance to begin. The rage had burned out, leaving behind only ashes in the cold, heavy weight of an unforgivable truth. He was condemned to live with the secret, buried deep inside, festering like the illness in his blood, a silent testament to the night vengeance turned into an unthinkable tragedy.